Good morning, everybody, and welcome to the Envision IT webinar on electronic forms and alternative SharePoint app approaches. My name is Peter Carson. I'm going to be your speaker for today. I'm also the president of Envision IT, a SharePoint MVP, and a partner seller with Microsoft Canada. All of my contact information is up on the slides here. We're going to be posting these slides up on our website after. So if you go to www.envisionit.com/events, you'll be able to pull down a copy of the deck from today, as well as a recording. That should be up probably by end of day today. We'll send out an email to everybody once we've got that online for you. Also on the phone, I've got Amanda DaCosta. Amanda is in charge of our sales at Envision IT. So if you've got any questions on what you've seen here today, interested in moving forward with projects and such, Amanda will be your prime point of contact from that perspective. So let's start out with a quick agenda of what we're going to cover off over the next hour or so. So we've already done the introductions. We're going to do a very brief overview of Envision IT, and then we're going to dive right into some background on SharePoint development, sort of a history course on how development has progressed through the various different versions of SharePoint. And then we're going to talk about some alternative app models, both why we'd want to do that and what benefits those give us. And then we're going to dive deeper into both some customer case studies and some behind the scenes of how we've built those solutions, both from a client-side code-only perspective and also using Visual Studio from a web API point of view. And those will make more sense as we talk more about the models and the decisions as we go through that. So let's start just with a brief overview of Envision IT. I'm not going to spend too much time on this, but I want to give a context as to who we are and what we do in the marketplace. So we are Office 365 productivity consultants. We've been working with SharePoint since back in the 2001 days, building public-facing websites, intranets, and extranets. So that's really our focus. And what we're talking about today with apps really has application across all three of those, whether you've got forms or apps that you want to put up on your public website in SharePoint, whether it's from an internal staff portal point of view, or whether you have an extranet or a member portal you want to expose that functionality. In fact, the case studies that I'm going to present today cover all three of those spectrums as well. In addition to delivering those solutions, we also provide training, not from a technical point of view, more from an end user, power user perspective. So how to use SharePoint from both a collaboration and a web content management. Key to success in our projects is making sure that the staff within the organizations we're working with really understand how to use the solutions that we're building. So training becomes a key part to that. We also have a product we sell called Extranet User Manager. I actually gave a webinar last week. I'm doing another one I'll mention at the end of this session later in May on building out extranets. And this is really about managing the people that are external to your organization. How do you collaborate effectively with them? How do you create their accounts, get their passwords to them, deal with forgotten passwords, all those sorts of things around that side of things. So that's it from an overview. We're going to dive in from here. But before we get into the details, I want to get a sense from an audience point of view in terms of what your experience is with SharePoint. And that'll help guide the conversation that we're going to be having over the next hour or so. So let me just open up the first poll here. I'm just going to do two. So the first is around which version of SharePoint you're currently using. I always like to know, are people already in Office 365? Are they running SharePoint Server 2013, 2010? Maybe they're still on Foundations or even older versions. And we typically see a fairly broad spectrum, although it's shifting. We're seeing more and more people using Office 365. We're going to have to add a SharePoint Server 2016 to this soon. We've got the big launch event happening next week, May the 4th, so tune in for that. Bill Baer from Microsoft is going to be presenting some future directions around SharePoint, so that'll be very interesting. So I'll leave that open for another 10 or 15 seconds, just to give everybody a chance to vote in on that. There we go. And let me just close that and share that back out. So actually a little lower than we've seen on some of the recent webinars from an Office 365 point of view. The last one I did on extranets last week was about half the folks were already in 365. Vast majority in SharePoint Server 2013, half still running 2010. So I guess there's some hybrids or multiple farms, which we often see where people have a variety of different SharePoint farms. Nobody's running Foundation, but a few folks on MOS 2007, WSS 3.0. The concepts that I'm going to be talking about here today really apply more from a 2010, predominantly 2013 and 365 point of view. So you might want to think about upgrading to a more recent version, and hopefully the discussions we have today help guide what that journey could look like. Okay, so one more poll that I just want to do is just around how you folks use SharePoint today. You know, is it strictly from an internal collaboration point of view? Do you use team sites, or do you do internal web publishing? Do you have your staff internet portal on SharePoint? Are you using it from an extranet perspective, or even from a public-facing website? Because we are going to cover off all these scenarios. I want to get a sense of who's using it how from that perspective. All right, we'll give you another 10, 15 seconds. We'll do the same thing and just share that back with everybody from that perspective. Okay, so let me just close that, share that back out. So as is typical, we see internal collaboration. We've seen that as high as 98% or so. I mean, that tends to be the first workload that people use SharePoint for. SharePoint's also very well penetrated from an internet perspective, and we're seeing that here as well. More than 3/4 of you using it from your staff portal perspective. About a third from an extranet's point of view, and a little less than a third from a public-facing website. So I think you'll all, you know, in all of those scenarios, you'll get some context as we go through here of how different app models can be used in each of those contexts. So let me hide that and come back to my deck here. All right, so as I mentioned, I want to start with a bit of background from a SharePoint development point of view. As I mentioned, you know, we've been working with SharePoint since the 2001 days. 2001, 2003, we didn't do a lot of custom development on, but when 2007 came along, that's when the web content management features came in. We saw a lot of intranet projects, public-facing websites on SharePoint, and we built a lot of full trust solutions. And basically what that means is you're writing code that runs on the SharePoint server itself, and it's very handy as a developer. I mean, as long as you've got a good development environment, and typically what we've done for our developers is each developer has their own virtual machine with SharePoint installed on it, and they basically have Visual Studio and SharePoint all running together on one server. So they can actually step through their code, write back-end server code that directly interfaces with SharePoint through the API. So very powerful, but the downside is very tied to the SharePoint server itself. So from an upgrade point of view, it can become a challenge. Maybe you don't have the solution packages for everything that was deployed into your older SharePoint farm. That can present a challenge as you move to a newer one. Those packages may not upgrade well from that perspective. So there was challenges there. And then Microsoft, when 2010 came out, said, okay, we're going to create this new model called Sandbox Solutions. Basic idea here was that you had the ability to run code on the server, but it was a much more limited set of code. And that was really to address the issue of rogue full trust solutions. I mean, if you built a poorly performing app as a full trust solution, that could bring the entire server farm architecture down. And that's really bad, particularly in a larger enterprise where it's being used for a lot of different purposes. So Sandbox basically puts a box around that and says, well, you can do a more limited set of things, and we're going to throttle you. So if you start using too much CPU or too many resources, we're actually going to scale back so you don't impact the server as a whole. It's an interesting concept with some challenges in that often we found that we weren't able to do the things that we needed to do, that they just weren't available in Sandbox solutions. And this was something that was available not only for on-premises SharePoint, but also SharePoint Online. Then SharePoint 2013 came along, and the idea of SharePoint apps came to the forefront. And this was really saying, you know what, we don't want you running your code on the SharePoint server itself. We're building this huge multi-tenant environment called SharePoint Online as part of Office 365. And the last thing we want is all sorts of tenants code running on those servers, even in a sandbox area. So they basically deprecated the sandbox approach, and the full trust solution was never an option from an Office 365 shared multi-tenant perspective. SharePoint Apps was really the only way to go. Originally out of the gate, there was 3 models to that. There was SharePoint hosted, which meant that basically the code that you write was custom JavaScript that ran in the browser, and it would call the client-side object model or REST APIs through JavaScript calls to build your app functionality. The second was what's called a provider hosted, and here your application was running on another IIS server outside of SharePoint altogether. And it had some back-end communication that it could talk server-side to the SharePoint farm in order to interact and do things on behalf of the user. And then the third was an Azure hosted. This was an idea that as an Office 365 tenant will allow you to spin up a number of hosted apps in Azure as part of your 365 subscription. For whatever reason, Microsoft decided to discontinue that, so we've really just got the two models now, the SharePoint hosted and the provider hosted. So we've kind of dove into the details. I won't rehash through the slides here, but it'll be available in the deck from that point of view. So it was nice that we had the full server API. We could run code in elevated permissions, but it didn't work on 365, and it certainly raised some challenges from an upgrade point of view. Sandbox was fairly limited and ultimately deprecated by Microsoft, so it's not a recommended solution. SharePoint hosted apps, as I mentioned, the client runs in the code and calls APIs. The key here is that whatever the user needs to do through these style of apps, they need to have direct permissions in SharePoint to do that. So there's no concept of running with elevated permissions within the browser for that. And I'll talk more about that decision point. And really that's the deciding factor between going to an apps model in SharePoint hosted versus provider hosted. Because in the provider hosted, you're running in a separate server. It is full backend server code, so you do have that option of running in elevated permissions. And then it runs inside of an iframe inside the SharePoint window. So what were some of the challenges? Why don't I like apps? And let me be honest, I'm not a big fan of the app model. And predominantly from an internal developer point of view. I mean, setting up that app store is complicated. There's some complexity around setting up a separate wildcard app domain. So what happens is each time an app gets initiated on your site, it creates a whole nother subdomain off your main URL for your SharePoint site. So there's some complexity around setting that up, having certificates provisioned for that, moving that between different environments, even the publishing of that externally, setting up your firewall rules to deal with those wildcard domains can add some complexity in there as well. And really the app models, it's intended to be added by end users, not something that we can easily script the deployment of the apps. Although I think they've addressed that more recently, although I haven't been working with apps more recently, so I can't directly comment on that. So why all this complexity? Why did Microsoft build the beast that is SharePoint apps? There is reasons where it makes a lot of sense. I mean, it's really intended for something that you're going to add to a site multiple times. And the best scenario for this is commercial apps. And here the app model makes perfect sense that you can go to a public store, you can purchase an app from a vendor, and you can install it onto your site fairly easily from that point of view. So end users can discover those apps and install it. I mean, you want probably some governance around that to decide who should be allowed to choose and install apps that are appropriate for the business. But the reality is that business apps that are built internally don't really require that complexity. It's not that you're going to build one of the examples I'm going to show you is a leave request form. So booking vacations, time off, things like that. I mean, it's not like your business users within your organization need to browse and install different leave request apps in different spots on your portal. It's going to be one place that HR manages that leave request form is going to live. So we don't really need the App Store complexity to deal with that. So custom apps like those, and we're going to show you more of those, they typically exist in only one or a couple of places, and we don't need that flexibility of end users being able to choose them and deploy them. We want actually the control to restrict that and lock that down. So what are some alternative app models? What's kind of on my wish list from an app perspective? Well, what I did is I started to put together a checklist for an ideal app model. So first thing, the provider-hosted, SharePoint-hosted apps, they actually run in an iframe in your window. So because they're running in a separate URL, in the case of SharePoint-hosted, it's a subdomain off of your main domain. In the case of provider-hosted, it's an entirely separate URL that it's going to. So the only way that you can incorporate that into your page from a user experience point of view and still keep the frame of SharePoint around that is to iframe that in. And I'm, to be honest, really not a fan of iframes. They present challenges. They don't work well from a mobile point of view. You often end up having multiple scroll bars on your page, which just isn't great from a UX perspective. And user experience is very important to me, so I'm keen to get rid of that. This whole wildcard DNS domains and messing with that adds complexity that I don't think is required. I'd rather things just run within the single SharePoint URL. Obviously, we need to not be running any code on the SharePoint server. We can't be going back to the full trust model. It just doesn't work from an Office 365 point of view. And it's actually not the best idea even from an on-premises. So even today, when clients come to us to build apps, even if they're not in Office 365, we're using the app model that we're going to be talking about here today in there because it just makes more sense across both environments. Great user experience is very important to us. Standard development model, and I don't mean a standard SharePoint development model, I mean truly standard development model that any web developer worth their salt that understands, HTML5, CSS3, JavaScript, jQuery, various open source tools is able to get up and running quickly and work with this. So you don't need any sort of special training on how to build SharePoint apps. You just need to be a good, solid web developer in general, not even a SharePoint web developer, to be able to understand how this works. We do need the ability to run with elevated permissions. There's scenarios where the users are not going to have the permissions against the underlying lists and libraries in SharePoint. So we need to have that idea of a service account and ability to manage that through there. And we want to integrate with more than just SharePoint. There's going to be third-party applications, commercial applications, SAP, Dynamics CRM, different line of business applications, SaaS applications that we want to integrate in as part of those apps. And again, we'll talk about some of those scenarios as we go through our session. All right, so what's the basis for our model here? So as I mentioned, we want it to be very standard. All the user experience code is going to be done in client-side code. So we're going to leverage HTML, CSS, JavaScript, as well as standard frameworks. So jQuery obviously is going to be very important. Everything we're building these days tends to be mobile friendly. Even if it's not a public-facing website, we want that ability through mobile, even from a staff portal perspective. Other tools like Handlebars, Knockout, Angular, TypeScript, we're going to talk about some of those as we go through our sessions as well. And I've touched on this a couple of times, this idea of running with elevated permissions. Do users have rights to do everything they need to do in SharePoint? And you can sometimes get around this using workflows, and in fact, I'm going to show an example where we do that, where the users have the ability to contribute to a list, but really they shouldn't see each other's contributions, and we want some security around there. We actually put a workflow to move those items to a different list and process them so that they're not available and visible to other users from that perspective. So you can work around that. It gets a little messy sometimes. Sometimes it's better to say, you know what, we're just not going to give users access to the underlying resources in SharePoint itself. We're going to put a proxy in between there, and we'll talk more about that. That can then run with elevated permissions to do that. Some things like column level security, you just can't do with SharePoint. You've got the ability to define security at the item level, but not at the column level. So if a column is there, but not intended to be used by the end users, it's there from a security or a business rule point of view. You don't want to expose that, then you need something in between the client-side code and the underlying SharePoint. So we'll show some examples of what that looks like. All right, so we've got first off the simpler option, which is client-side code only. If we take this back to the SharePoint app model, this really corresponds to a SharePoint hosted app. It's the same idea where we're going to simply use JavaScript on the client side, so all the custom code that we write is actually going to run in the browser on the client's desktop to interact with the system from there. So it can be used for presentation of read-only data. We'll talk about some catalog publishing and visualizations. It can also be used for some simple forms as well, and we'll take you through some examples of that. So let's have a look at what that looks like. Basically, what we're going to be doing is from that client-side code, we're going to be calling into either the client-side object model or to the REST APIs. And these are two different ways of accessing SharePoint as a developer. So REST seems to be the preferred path. That's where Microsoft is making their bigger investments in. The client-side object model does make a lot of sense in certain scenarios. I'm going to show you examples of both of those and why we would choose one over the other through there. Okay, I'm going to start with our Shakespeare reference project. If you've been on past webinars with me, you've probably seen a reference to this. This is basically our reference project where we take a lot of our learnings and techniques and we roll them back into this core project. So as we're adding new projects and starting new client work, we use this as a starting point, and it basically provides a structure to a project for us. You can actually download a copy of it yourself if you go to www.envision.it.com/Shakespeare. There's actually a full open source copy of that. I haven't refreshed it recently. We're kind of halfway through updating it to run with Office 365. It's currently built for SharePoint on premises. So once we've got that finished up, we'll push a new version of that up. So you can actually use it both from a 365 point of view and from a on-premises point of view. But what I'm going to do is just flip out to the actual site itself. So let me come over to my browser here and to my shakespearedev.envisionit.com site. So this is a publicly available site. You can actually hit it yourself. You'll see the same pages that we're seeing here. And what I want to illustrate is some of the roll-up information that we're doing on here. Now you could do this with content search web parts in either SharePoint on-premises or Office 365. There's actually a fair bit of complexity in those as well. They're not an app, but they come with their own complexity. What we want to do is a similar idea of doing catalog publishing through SharePoint, which is a really powerful feature of SharePoint 2013 and Office 365 in an easier way. Let's use this new apps model to look at how that's done. So we've got a couple different things on the page here. We've got an ImageRotator here. It's built using an open source slider called Nevo, very flexible slider, very commonly used. And we're using the client-side app model that we've created here to drive that slider. So we've basically got a image library under the hood with the images we want to have on the page through the rotations. The content author just drops new images in there, and away they go. They can then become part of the rotation. Likewise, we have news articles and media spotlights here as well. So these are all just list items in SharePoint, and we're using REST calls to expose those. So on the home page, what we want is the three most recent news articles being rolled up on our home page based on a search query. And I'm going to show you actually under the hood how this is built and wired together. So I've gone in what we call debug mode here. Actually, my browser is not responding. Let me just refresh that. Oh, my debug just disappeared. Bear with me here. I'm going to sign into the site and take you into that. So if I go to my Envision page, this is a handy link we put on all of our sites that we build, just a spot for content authors to come to say, hey, if I want to manage content like those news articles on the home pages, let me just open up that list. It's literally just a list of news articles. They're not even pages through there. And then the cross-site publishing that we're using that I'm going to show you actually drives that functionality. But let me come over to the REST debug page that I wanted to show at the beginning here. My server seems to be running a little slow today. Here we go. So I want to turn on my REST debugging. So we built this as a page to help with development of these style of apps. So if I come back to my home page now that I've turned that debugging on, I should actually see a debug link there. So there we go, right off under the news roll-up. If I click on that, what it's going to do is it's going to take me back to that page that I was just on with the actual query that's being used to drive that particular news roll-up. So this is, we haven't written the API for this. This is using standard out-of-the-box SharePoint APIs. In fact, I can take that URL here. Let me just copy that. I'm going to paste it into a new browser window here. So I'm directly hitting the SharePoint 2013 REST search API saying, I'm executing my query, give me back the results from there. Now this isn't very friendly to see. It's basically the XML structure that comes back from that query with all the data. We can see titles and values and dates and URLs and things all coming back as part of that. And what we do with our debug page is we just make that a little simpler to use. I can actually execute that query right through this page here. And we parse those results. We're using jQuery AJAX call here to do that same REST call, take the results back that comes back as a block of JSON, parse that apart and show it on the screen here. So I can see how long did that search query take to run, how many rows did I get back, what are the total number of rows that are actually available there, and what's the actual data that comes back from that. So we're using a Telerik open source developer control here, grid control, to actually show the results. So I can see, the titles, the article dates, the URLs of those items, all the information that's coming back from that call. And if we come up to the query here, let me actually size this up a bit for you here, make it easier to see that. We can actually see the structure of the query. So I'm calling into the search API here, and I'm giving it, first off, this query template properties URL. This is something we need to do for anonymous calls to search because this is a public website. And then we've got the actual query text. So we're going against a particular path. So I'm going against that news list that we were pointing at previously. And I want to get news items back from that. And I want to get particular properties. I need the title, the article date, the URL of the item, and I only need 3 items back. So this is a roll-up for the home page. And I want the 3 most recent, so I'm going to do a date descending order on the article start date. So right in this page here, I can actually play around with those and say, you know what, I don't want 3 items. I know there's 8 in there. Let me actually do a row limit of 8, resubmit that. And is that coming back for me? No, it's still giving me my 3 there, so it's not cooperating. Okay, I'm actually doing the webinar from home here. I think I'm having a little bit of network grief on my machine, so we'll just skip on that. But basically, this is illustrating how we can use the out-of-the-box SharePoint APIs to build a very interactive display on the pages here. So we can build these kinds of roll-ups. And we don't really have time in this session here right now, but what we're doing is we're using a knockout model to actually take what comes back from that search query and format it into the nicely formatted HTML that we have here. So it's a nice way of taking that, and basically what we end up with is some content editor web parts with a little bit of HTML that drive how this is going to be displayed on here. So it's very flexible. It's very easy once you've got this structure here to build more from there. If I come over into the news and media page, I mean, it's basically doing the same style of queries, but giving a broader set of list items. We're actually doing a roll-up image as part of that as well. So we've got a slightly different template for this one here, but going against the same list and giving us the same data back. All right, let me just come back to our slideshow here. We actually do a similar kind of thing on our Envision IT site. So a little more complex, actually. What we do here is if you come to our events page, we can see our upcoming and recent events. So these are actually 2 HTML blocks doing 2 REST calls saying get me future events and get me the 3 most recent past events and present them up on the page here. These events are actually shared. So if I come over to our Extranet User Manager site, I can see we've got the same events on here as well. We should actually share them across. The site's cross-linked, so when I click into, say, this webinar that we're doing here today, it's actually going to take me back over onto the Envision IT site and bring up the details of that event. So that's all being driven through those REST calls and through the catalog publishing features of SharePoint 2013. It lets us do the cross-site publishing, gives us the friendly URLs, which are great from an SEO point of view, to tie that all together. And then the last area that I want to show you from our website's point of view is into our case studies section. Same sort of idea here. We're doing a REST call to say, go get me all the case studies that are in the site. So we use content types to organize that content, and then present them up on the page here. And once we're in here, we've actually got a very simple jQuery driven interface where I can pick different solution types or different industries and present up different case studies from there. What we're doing is we're not actually even going back to SharePoint as I click on these. The initial load of the page has done the search call and said, get me all the case studies, including their solution types and industries. And then client-side, through this app that we've created, we're just doing a jQuery select into that full list to say, well, get me all of the featured items and show them up in the case study here. So you can see how we can build some very nice user interfaces, user experiences, using those underlying out-of-the-box tools that are there as part of the tool set in SharePoint. So let me come back to my presentation. There we go. So we did the custom user experience there. And the next one I want to do is still a client-side app, but now we don't want to just present information. We actually want to build a form that submits information back. And this is a project that we're just about to go live actually for the Pentecostal Assembly of Canada. And there's a number of forms that we created here. So this is also an on-premise SharePoint 2013 portal. The idea here is it's a pensioner portal for both the current and the retired staff with PAOC. And there's a number of forms that they want to have on this. 2 of them are simple update forms. So I've changed my address information or I'm changing my banking information that we want to write to SharePoint lists. And then the third one is a pension calculator for actually calculating your benefits payable at retirement. So the first one is a very simple one. It's built using jQuery and the out-of-the-box SharePoint REST APIs. The second one, because there's a fair bit more interaction, we've actually used Knockout, which is another open source model to do that. So we've got some slide views here, but I think it probably looks better if we go over into the live site, into our dev environment here. So let me see here. Yeah, so let me actually start with the address update form. So this is probably the simplest of the 3 forms. It's basically for providing update information. Now this is a an intranet/extranet application, so everybody's authenticated and signed in. It is a bilingual site, so we built the forms to be both French and English. And it knows who I am because I'm logged in. So the form can actually pull my name and my employee ID, which is actually my Active Directory account, from the current session and put that on the form. So I don't actually fill those fields in. And then I just fill in the remaining fields to say, okay, effective May 1st, I'm going to be moving, or April 30th, let's say, and here's my new address information, and go ahead and submit that. So we've got some required field validators in there to say, okay, which fields need to be filled in at a minimum level before I can submit that. And then when it submits, it's basically writing that to a list. So again, it's using a REST call, just like we saw on the Envision IT site, except in this case, we're not doing a read call to search, we're actually doing a post to a SharePoint list to say, take all this information that's filled in on here and post it into that SharePoint list. We built this form in a fairly flexible way in the sense that the form HTML is actually built dynamically. So it's based off of the SharePoint list itself. So we use another REST call to hit the list to say, well, what are all the fields that are on that list and which fields are required and not, and we actually dynamically build the field validators. And the advantage to that is that later down the road, PAOC wants to do some changes to this form, maybe they want to capture an additional piece of information, they can simply add a new column to the SharePoint list and it'll show up in the form here. So they don't actually need to do any code changes as part of that. And the way that we've done security on this is that everybody has contribute access, but you can only read and edit your own items. So yes, they can go under the hood to the direct SharePoint list, but they can only see the items that they've submitted through there. And we've done the same thing with the banking information update. If you've changed your banking information in terms of where you need your direct deposit to be happening, you can use this form to update that information through there. This one's a little bit more secure. We still have the same, you can only see your own items in there. We actually put a workflow on that as well to move those items out of that list. And as soon as they're processed, the workflow removes them from the list entirely. So we don't actually keep a record of that banking information in the SharePoint list, just from a security perspective. And again, this one's driven from the underlying list, so if they wanted to add new fields to it, it's fairly straightforward to do that. In fact, if they want to create a whole net new form, still on this same sort of model, they could create a new list, point the HTML for the form at that new list, and it would generate the actual form fields away from there. So they can actually use this as a general purpose tool to build additional forms, as long as they're within the style here. I mean, we haven't built this as a complete, say, Nintex Forms replacement kind of thing, where we support all the different field types and such through there. It's fairly limited to text fields, date fields, and that's about the level of support that we've got through there. But again, fairly flexible from that perspective. And then the third one is the pension calculator. So this one's a little bit more involved. Now, right now, some of this information we do have in the underlying portal in terms of past contribution history and things like that. But basically, we don't have it in a form we can easily access. They're inside PDFs in document libraries and things like that. So what we said is, okay, just refer to your annual benefit statement, which is actually another section in the portal. So they actually open that PDF up, note the values, type them into the form here, and then they can start to play with their different figures. Say, okay, what how much longer am I going to be working? How much am I going to be contributing per year? And what is the annual projected benefit going to be looking like at age 65? So you can start to work through different scenarios from that point of view. So it becomes a very interactive exercise from that perspective. So again, those are 3 forms examples using strictly client-side code. So there's nothing on the server. There's no server APIs as part of that. So let's come back to our PowerPoint deck. So let's come back to this discussion of elevated permissions. The scenarios that we just saw, we were able to do those by allowing those users to have direct access to those SharePoint lists. So they could bypass the forms and they could go in and just add something in directly through there. The business rules are fairly loose on those ones. There's not a lot of column level security or interdependencies saying if this field's filled in this way, this other field is required. you can build some of those rules in JavaScript, but I'm not a fan of enforcing business rules in JavaScript. It's just too easy to bypass those. You get a savvy user that hits F12 and goes into the developer toolbar, they could actually step around those rules and do what they want from that point of view, or actually directly access the SharePoint lists and put stuff in that way. So if you don't want that, if you need to provide a higher level of security in there, you need to look at running an elevated permissions. We need somewhere else for that code to run than on the SharePoint server itself. This is where we get into Visual Studio Web API projects. So it's part of ASP.NET 4.5. So you've got access to the full .NET functionality. You can use whatever .NET language you choose to. Typically, we're building these in C# code, which is what I'm going to be showing you here today. And you can deploy these on premises or up in Azure. And really that depends often more on where your SharePoint is. If your SharePoint is in Office 365, you're probably going to be deploying these into Azure so that everything's in the cloud. If you've got an on-premises SharePoint environment, you can actually deploy the Web API projects right onto SharePoint itself. In fact, from an authentication point of view, if you are going on-premise, you can actually cheat a bit and say, well, let's deploy these Web APIs onto the SharePoint server. I said, the app model was to get the code off of the SharePoint server. We're breaking that rule a little bit here. It does make things a lot simpler from an authentication point of view. And longer term, if you say, well, we want to keep our options open to migrate that to Office 365 later, the model still holds. It's just you're going to have to add a little bit more authentication code into those web APIs later, but you don't have to do it right now. So it's just something to be aware of. Do you pay me now or pay me later in terms of where you put that complexity in? So if we think about authentication for web APIs, this is the biggest challenge in terms of getting this all wired together and working. And the simplest is just having an anonymous web API. This is useful for anonymous form submits. So if you've got a public-facing website, some of you had that, and you want to have forms on that site to submit into SharePoint, you're not going to want to allow anonymous contribute access into your SharePoint sites. That's just not a good thing from a security point of view. You can put a web API in front of that, and it really simplifies permissions from that perspective. The people that are submitting the form don't need any access whatsoever into those underlying SharePoint lists because it's all running as that service account inside the web API. We can leverage the SharePoint authentication. So if we did do the cheat and put it under the IIS application for SharePoint, then we have access to the user's SharePoint identity. So the backend C# code actually can understand who that user is, what groups they belong to, things like that. And it can start to build business rules based on those security permissions within that. It can use that user to access SharePoint directly, or it can still run with elevated permissions if we want a separate service account to do that access. And then Azure Active Directory, this is ideal for Office 365. So basically you register your web API as an app in Azure Active Directory. And then when the call comes in from Office 365, because that's the registered app in Azure AD and authentication to Office 365 was done through Azure AD as well, then we have access to that user identity. And we can actually do things on behalf of that user against Office 365. Or again, we can run with a service account with elevated permissions, whichever makes more sense from that perspective. So the first scenario I'm going to take you through is a public-facing website. This is a site actually built for my wife. She's a high school librarian in Milton, and part of the site feature was to have a technological resources calendar. And the idea is that teachers need to be able to request resources, whether they need to book out a bank of Chromebooks or one of the rooms, or even the teacher librarian themselves. How did they make that request? Well, we want the site to be anonymously available, but we want some confirmation around that. And ultimately, it's going to run right into a SharePoint library that the librarian has approvals rights to, and once it's approved, it gets published out to the site. And we want the whole thing to be mobile friendly. So I actually have a dev version of this site up here. So let me just go over to this site here. So I can start at the home page of the site. We've got an ImageRotator. It's using the same REST search calls to drive that, Twitter feed coming in through there. Then if we come down into the calendars and technological resources, we'll come to the area that we're looking at here. So we see the end user view. We've got some published events in that SharePoint event calendar, and we've got a technological resources request form link here. So if I click that link, it's going to take me to that HTML view of that form, still within SharePoint itself. So I've still got my main nav, my breadcrumb, my left nav and such. So it feels like I'm in the same site because I am in fact still in the same site. This is just a content editor web part pointing to a block of HTML that presents up this form. The whole site's being built with Twitter Bootstrap from a responsive point of view. So if I pull this site down, let's imagine we're on a mobile device here. We've got our nice hamburger menu from a Bootstrap point of view, and I've got my form that works very well from a smartphone. So a teacher running around, can fire up their phone, go to the public site, not even have to log in, just put in their name, their email, and the details of what they're requesting for what date and what period from there. So they don't even have to think about the times. They just think period 1 through 5 in the schedule, and it figures out the schedule for them. And they go ahead and submit that. What happens when they submit that? So they don't have rights to the underlying SharePoint list. In fact, I can open up another window here. We can actually see a list item here or the actual full set of list items. So this underlying SharePoint list, they'd have read access to published items, but they wouldn't see any of the pending approval items through there as an anonymous user. Okay, so how is that submit going to happen? It's through a Visual Studio Web API. So let me flip over to Visual Studio for a minute here. I'm not going to go too deep into coding in this session. I just want to kind of illustrate concepts through here. Basically, what I've got is a web API project here. So I've got backend C# code here. Like if I want to do a post of a new calendar item, it's going to call this post method. Actually, I was doing some edits here. Let me take that out. And it's going to take in a model that basically has all the properties of that form, all the different fields on it, and it's going to write into SharePoint. So here we're actually using the client-side object model, which works really well in C# code for doing things like accessing a list and updating a list. So you can see here, we're going to go against that technological resources list. We're going to create a new item. We're going to set all of these properties, like what's the teacher's name, their email, things like that, to that list, and then update it. And then we're also going to send an email out to the teacher saying, hey, you just requested a resource in the library. I need you to confirm that you are who you say you are. We don't want students coming in here and gaming the system and messing up and impersonating teachers, things like that. So what we do is we send out an email to the email address of the requester that they entered themselves just to confirm to say they are who they say they are. And in there, we're going to have a link for them to validate that request. So it takes them to this confirm tech resources page. Basically, they just click that link and it's actually going to do a validation. So that link calls into this validate calendar item that says, hey, does the GUID match with what's on that particular list item? And if it is, then it's validated, and whoever that user was actually is who they say they are. It could still be a student, but they'd actually have to put their student email in for that. And then when it comes to an approval point, you can flag that and say, well, that's not a teacher's email address. This is not a teacher that's making a request. I'm going to deny that request. So that's basically how that flows through. And then we've got an HTML form here, which basically has all the various different fields, like the teacher name, the email, the course code, and such, rendered up through here. And at the end, it's got a submit button that submits that through some JavaScript. So we've got a little bit of JavaScript here that basically does some validation to say, okay, are all the required fields filled in? That looks good. Figure out where I'm posting it to, where's that API exposed, and then build up that response with all the various different values off the form. And it uses a jQuery AJAX call to post that into the web API. So I can actually run this form in a couple different ways. Let me actually set the API as my startup project first here. And I'll just do an F5 run on that. And what it'll do, we've used a couple of open source pieces from Microsoft called Swagger and Swashbuckler. And it basically builds us a documentation package for the API that we've created. So if I want to post a new calendar item in here, I can see what that API looks like. Here's the model of all the things that need to get submitted in through there. So, my teacher name, my email. Actually, I need to make sure I put a valid email in there. Let me just put my email address in. And I can actually try that out. So it'll run that code and post that into the list. So it came back here, it was response code 200, which means it was successful, and it's done that post. So actually, if I come back to my list and refresh it, we'll see a few seconds ago, that item went in there. Now, most of the items were just dummy data. I didn't bother filling them in properly, but we should see my email address in through there. There's my peter@envisionit.com. So it'll send me that requester ID or validation email with this GUID. And ultimately, if I click that link, it's going to set that validated to yes through there. So that'll confirm that, yes, the person that requested it based on this email address is actually that person. They validated that. We can now proceed to the approval state from that. So once it gets approved, then it's published and visible on the calendar for everybody to see. It's a very interactive form, works well from a mobile device point of view. We don't have security around it from a login point of view, so we've used an email validation step as part of the workflow to do that validation process. Now, if I come back to my Visual Studio for a minute, let me just stop this form. And I'll set this as my startup project. So from a debugging point of view, I can run the same form that we were seeing in the SharePoint page, just locally as part of my Visual Studio project. I can work out all the details of my JavaScript, get all that working and functioning. I can actually step through that code in Visual Studio. So it's great from a development point of view. And then I just literally take that HTML. So if we look here at this HTML, I just take that and drop it into my SharePoint site as a block of HTML to be included on the page. So when we come back to our page here, it looks much prettier in here because we've got all the CSS and Bootstrap and formatting and my date picker and everything functioning as part of that. But it's actually the exact same HTML and the same JavaScript that I was working in my Visual Studio project. So as a developer, it's very easy. I get to write my C# code from my backend code here in terms of how I interact with SharePoint. I build very plain vanilla HTML to do my form, and I write a little bit of JavaScript that basically takes that form data and posts it to my API. So from a model perspective, it's actually a very simple model for developers to get their head around how they do that kind of coding. It gives them flexibility of doing deeper business rules on the back-end code and doing whatever they'd like to do from a presentation point of view on the front-end code through there. Okay. So that's that one there. Let's switch gears now to an internal form. So this is a leave request form that we've developed both for ourselves and for a number of our clients. So the idea is if you're booking vacation days, sick days, what have you, it needs to take those requests through a workflow approval process, but it also needs to track the allocation and accruals of what vacation days people have available to them. It leverages Active Directory from a manager point of view, from an approvals perspective, and it also needs to enforce security. So what we've done is we've kept all the, who has how many vacation days and how do they accrue over the year in SharePoint lists, but we don't want people to have access to those lists directly. Obviously that's fairly confidential HR information. People shouldn't see other people's comp plans, which vacation is part of. So what we do is we build a web API in front of that, and we manage the permissions in that. So if you're doing the form for yourself, obviously you can see your own allocations, but if your manager is approving your form, they need to see your allocations as well. So we can look up the Active Directory manager tree to understand, should this person see the requested person's allocations and such and display their requests through there. So we can build a complex security model all based on the HR reporting structure that's in Active Directory, rather than having to do weird things with permissions inside of SharePoint, which would get out of hand from a management point of view. And this is fully supported on Office 365 as well. So if we come over to my browser here, let's have a look at some of the forms. So this is the form that we created for use internally at Envision IT. It's fairly simple. I choose my request type. I want to request vacation. It already knows who I am. I report to myself at the top of the chain. What days am I requesting off? Well, I'm looking for next week, so May 2nd to May 6th. Now we did say, okay, we're not going to auto-calculate the number of business days because of stat holidays and things like that. We're going to make it simple and just allow the user to enter in their own and say, well, I'm booking 5 days off from there. I've done too many test requests, so I actually have -2 available vacation days. This is our dev site, so it's not the real system from that point of view. And I would go ahead and save that request. And I can see past requests in the grid here to see any details on previous requests through there as well. So when I submit that request, it's going to trigger off in this case, an in-text workflow to drive that approval process, to go to my manager to say, hey, Peter just requested 5 days off. Here's a link to the item, have a look, and then do the approval from there. So we can manage that fairly simple approval process in our case. Now what we did is we actually took that concept and we applied that same form to a couple of our other clients. One of them, County of Simcoe, a fairly complex example. So in their case, they're not Office 365. We are, they're on premises. We wanted to use the same model. They may go to Office 365 in the future. We also wanted to tightly integrate it in with SAP, which is their HRIS system. So again, we built our own REST API. It talked not only to SharePoint, but also to SAP. So things like the allocations we don't get from a SharePoint list, we actually live connect to SAP to get that data. Likewise, the manager reporting structure comes from SharePoint. Now the requests themselves, we actually write those back to SharePoint. And the idea is, again, we'd use Nintex from a workflow approval point of view. So all the approvals happen in SharePoint. When it gets to the final approval stage, because it's a multi-step approval, at that point, we push the request back into SAP to say, okay, this is an approved vacation request. Let's put it back in the HRIS so it's there from a record point of view. So if we look at that form, let me just flip to the next tab here. You can see it looks fairly similar, but it is very much based off of the original. Now you can see here we've got some flexibility to say, okay, the manager is actually a multi-select field. So you may have your direct manager, but there may be alternate managers because you know your direct manager is off themselves and maybe not able to approve. You can go to an alternate and have them approve for you from there. We can choose either a single or a multiple date range, and the form actually morphs depending on which that is. So if it's a single day, I can actually break up my my request type to say, oh, I want to take, half of my shift. So we actually pull the live schedule from SAP of when people are working and say, okay, on the 28th, you're working for 7 hours. A lot of the staff are long-term care workers, paramedics that work shift work, so their shifts are not regularly scheduled from that point of view. I could say, well, I want to do vacation for 4 of those hours, and I wanted to lieu overtime that I've banked for the 3 hours. As long as that 7 hours there matches the 7 hours working on the day that I'm requesting, everything's good from that point of view. And I can see what's available, how many hours do I have in my vacation bank, in my float, and banked overtime, 6 days carried over. So there's a lot of different types of time off that we're drawing from there. When I hit the save request here, it calls our web API, writes that back into SharePoint. And again, that underlying SharePoint list, just like in our implementation, is not visible to staff as a whole. The only way that you see it or see past requests and things like that is accessing through that web API. So we can use that manager structure in SAP to build our permissions model around who can see what through there. So we can get quite sophisticated in terms of how we build these applications out. The last one I want to touch on is actually still a work in progress. So this is for the College of Early Childhood Educators. We built their public website on SharePoint 2010 about, I guess it was early in the 2010 days, so it's coming on 6 years old now. It's been there for quite a while. Not mobile friendly. That wasn't a big requirement at that point in time. And they've been talking for some time now about building a mobile friendly version of that. So they've committed to that. We're actually in process of building a mobile friendly SharePoint 2013 site as we speak. And there was 2 forms on the existing site, which were simple Word forms that people would download, print, fill in, and email back in. And they had a lot of challenges around people correctly filling those forms in or choosing the wrong forms, things like that. We wanted a better intake process around those forms. Now these forms are anonymously submitted, so they're like the library forms we were talking about at the beginning. They're a much more sophisticated form though. There's a lot of detail that needs to get captured in there. There's documents that need to go attached as part of that. So what we do is we still have our Visual Studio REST API and our front-end client-side form that submits to that, submits the document attachments, and that back-end code, what it does is it actually creates a document set in SharePoint, and it actually generates a Word version of the report that they've submitted. So it takes all the fields they've filled in the online form and actually creates a rich text formatted Word document as part of that. And it also uploads all those attached documents into that document set. And that becomes the working space for the college going forward from a disciplinary or a complaints review process point of view. Any additional documents, anything else related to that case, all get attached into that document set. Longer term, this is going to get wired into CRM as well, and that'll be part of the process too. So what do these forms look like? As you can see here, this is actually one form. I wasn't able to capture it as one streaming, so I kind of split it across 3 there. So let's actually flip over and show you what that form looks like. So here I've gone to just a simple HTML mockup of the form. Actually, let me zoom that back out again. So this is not actually the live SharePoint site just yet. It's a mock-up from a design point of view. So we're in the midst of actually building this as a real live form within SharePoint. So we've got all the employer information. We're looking at the mandatory employer report. There's also a public complaint form as well. What member does this apply to? Contact information. There may be multiple incidents, so we have the ability to add additional incidents through here or remove through that. In fact, we're going to be extending both the member information and the contact information with a similar concept. So you could have multiple members, you can have multiple contacts, all as part of that one incident report that you're filling out through there. We get down to the bottom, there's some police information, charges may be related to that, and there's an area for uploading files. So you can actually literally just drag files right onto the form itself. We're going to be removing this signature section because they're not actually going to physically sign it. By submitting, they're indicating a signature, so we need to put some legal context in that. But when they hit that submit button, they're going to call into that Visual Studio REST API that we're creating for this particular project, and it'll then go through all of that work of saying, okay, well, let's create that document set in SharePoint, let's generate a Word version. So we use a third-party product to take all the data from the form and a template in Word and mash that together and actually create a Word version of that and upload all those attached documents through there. So that was my last example through there. I haven't really taken a pause to see if we've got questions through there. Amanda or Dinesh on the line. Is there anything specific that in the last couple of minutes here I should circle back on? The advantage here is strictly from a design point of view. I mean, rather than building a wireframe, we actually wanted to create a real live mock-up that they could see not only from a desktop point of view, but how does that behave from a mobile perspective. And the HTML that we've created here literally becomes the form itself. So you think back to the library example, we've got our HTML form. This effectively is the mock-up. So we don't do dual work. We don't have to recreate this as the real form. Once we've done the static HTML mock-up of that, that actually becomes the basis for the project. So then we just add in the JavaScript code that actually does the submit and talking back to the web API, and we're done. But it lets the client see an early version of that to say, do we have all the right fields? Are the required fields correct in there? Let's get all those details worked out from that point of view. Any other questions that I should cover off? Okay, just a quick note, upcoming webinar. So later in May, Thursday, May 26th, we're going to be doing an extranets in SharePoint and Office 365 webinar. So we're going to be covering off a number of real-world customer case studies and talking about that from a context of on-premises and Office 365. Coming back to this session here, as I mentioned, we'll be putting the slide deck and the recording up on our events site, so have a look there. I'm actually going to add another slide in before I upload that with the links to the various different things that we've talked about here as well. Make that available to you. If you're interested and you want some help, I actually deliver sort of a more in-depth hands-on version of this session as a training session, done that with a number of our clients, so happy to do that. Or if you have actual app opportunities that you'd like built, Envision IT is certainly more than capable of building those out for you. So reach out to Amanda and love to hear from you from that perspective. So with that, a couple minutes early, so I'll give you a few minutes back from that perspective. Thanks very much for joining us, and hope you join us for another webinar.